and welcome to Dialogue. Following U.S. President Donald Trump's reciprocal tariffs announcement, China says it will impose additional 34% tariffs on all imported U.S. products starting April the 10th. How will these bilateral tariffs impact China-U.S. trade relations? How are countries around the world responding to the new U.S. tariffs? And what could be the short and long-term consequences for the global economy and global trade? Join us for our discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Adam Dunnett, Secretary General of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China, Takuji Okubo, and Managing Director and Chief Economist of Japan Macro Advisors, Professor Madhav Nalapat, Vice Chairman of Manipal Advanced Research Group, and Michael San, Managing Director of Apolonia Capital. Welcome to Dialogue. Well, let's say, Adam, I'll start with you. Before we touch upon the Chinese countermeasures against the Trump's tariffs, let's take a closer look at the Trump's tariffs. First, there is this assertion, the term reciprocal tariff, because it's reciprocal. Seems like the U.S. tariff somehow mirrored the tariff rates by other nations on U.S. goods. But this, of course, potentially violates most favored nation MFN or status by unilaterally changing tariffs based on the policies relationship with another individual country. So what about this minimum 10% baseline tariffs align with WTO rules, or does WTO still count in this situation?
Yeah, it's a extremely strange situation that we're in right now. I mean, the WTO provides its most favored nation status, which has been a great arrangement historically, by which any country that accords one tariff or one preferential treatment towards one country thereby provides it to all. So it's a way of creating equal and fair treatment and best treatment for all players. But in Trump's approach, I've been on the U.S. Trade Representative website looking at the calculation. It's very convoluted. It's not clear, but the objective is clear, and that's to find a trade balance with the U.S.'s partners, which something historically has never practically made sense for anybody. The U.S. has actually benefited hugely from a global open trading market, despite having a trade deficit. So that concept of it being equal or zero just doesn't make sense.
Mr. Okubo, are you concerned with this, potential challenge to this, or systematic challenge to this, what we used to call multilateral trading system, or globalization, or free trade?
Yes, indeed. I think this multilateral free trade regime has been on a decline. It's actually not the first time that the WTO stopped functioning. WTO has actually stopped functioning for many years already. So I think this destruction of post-World War II free trade regime has been deteriorating for some time.
Professor Nalapat, what's your observation? What's the impact you foresee out of this, basically, Trump 2.0, another round of trade war, but this is much larger scale against everybody else, basically?
Look, of course, different countries have a different impact, and they react differently. I mean, later on we can talk about the reaction of my country, India, where the entire reaction is supervised by Prime Minister Modi. But the reality is globalization is a myth. For example, manpower is absolutely forbidden. In so many countries, it has been forbidden. And legal manpower was forbidden. What is the consequence in Europe? What is the consequence in across the Atlantic? The consequence was that illegal immigrants flooded across, and frankly, they don't bring the skill sets that trained legal migrants could have brought across. But no, labor, it's very difficult to get the under so-called globalization, it doesn't recognize labor. Even services, there are a lot of restrictions on services. In Indian services, for example, are excellent, but a lot of restrictions are there on them. So very frankly, globalization is a lovely word, but the fact is it's only a very small part of the world that has derived the benefit from globalization, and the
Yes.
majority of the countries in the world have not had that benefit.
Okay, maybe for convenience sake, people call it globalization. But anyway, Professor, let me continue with you here. If you look at the tariffs, like on India, 26%, on European Union for 20%, Japan 24%. What is the calculation method? And people have been, seeing that this is a bit not that sophisticated. Probably it has little to do with actual tariff from countries.
Look, Trump is sticking to his textbook. He's been having the same textbook for 40 years. And yes, I agree the world has changed in 40 years, but the textbook that Trump has been using is the same which he began using and talking about 40 years ago. I'm surprised that anyone was surprised by what he's done. And the reality of the situation is that he has been talking about an absence of a trade deficit with any country. Now, yes, frankly, I also don't think it's a good solution in every circumstance. But my comment about the tariffs that he's imposed, he is completely not discriminated enough between friendly countries and adversary countries. And he has treated the former as basically on the same lines as the latter. That can create a few complications, but don't forget again, let's be honest, the European Union, for example, most of the existing leaders, they've hated Trump for 20 years or 15 years, at least since he was president for the first time. And certainly they hated him when he was an ex-president, and they were very unhappy that he was not elected. So, wait, is it going to add to his unpopularity? He's already deeply unpopular, and he really doesn't bother about leaders that he's unpopular with. He goes ahead with the leaders who are popular with.
Right, but is he popular with his 26% tariff on Indian goods?
Look, we have responded very coolly and calmly. We have not imposed any kind of tariff, and we are quite confident that with regulatory and fiscal mechanisms in place, we'll be able to sort it out.
Okay.
I mean, the Prime Minister is personally looking into that. As far as we are concerned, quite frankly, you look at the statement of the Commerce Ministry, it's a very cool-headed, rational statement, and we have not basically responded the way so many countries responded by creating our own tariffs against U.S. goods.
Okay.
We have not done that.
Okay.
We'll see this play its own course, and then, of course, we'll keep adjusting depending on that.
Well, Adam, of course, like if you look at this, people sometimes are kind of puzzled by the tariffs, in particular the specific numbers. Former U.S. Secretary of Treasury Lawrence Summers, tweeted, quote, "It's now clear that the administration computed reciprocal tariffs without using tariff data. This is like to economists, that creationism is to biology, astrology is to astronomy, or RFK thought is to vaccine science." So the Trump tariff policy makes little sense, even if you believe in protectionist, mercantilist economics. The response from the European Union is strong, but will that be followed by specific countermeasures against Trump?
Well, first of all, on the calculation again, I encourage your listeners to go to the U.S. Trade Representative's website. There is an explanation. It's not very easy to understand, but there is an explanation there for those that want to try it. The EU's response, a little bit like the commentator earlier was saying about India, has been one of to keep relatively calm so far. Ursula von der Leyen has issued a statement, the Commission's president talking about the danger and impact of this, at the same time willing to work with the U.S. There have been a number of high-level exchanges just in the last few weeks, trying to avoid getting into the situation that we find ourselves getting into now. But the EU has said it will respond as well. It's given itself a 4-week period to think carefully about this, but I'm sure they've got a list. And I mean, look, the EU and US are each other's very, very strong trading partners. They've got a strong historical trading and investment relationship with each other, but they've been through periods, I have to say, not quite like this, but they have had periods before where they've put tariffs on each other, and the EU has, they've applied tariffs when they've need to on US goods coming into Europe. And so I'm sure they've got a list that's prepared, and they're just waiting to see if they need to use it.
Well, of course, for Japan, Mr. Okubo, 24% on tariffs. What's that calculation? I mean, Japan is the largest investor in the U.S., right, in terms of foreign direct investment, but still 24%.
Yes, we are. 24% is, I think the rationale behind it is it's not economic. It's fairly irrational in a sense that, if you keep it's actually one way for U.S. to really balance trade balance. Just put U.S. economy into a deep recession so that U.S. economy basically stopped importing things. That's actually one easy way for U.S. president to really balance the trade balance if they want. But I think from Japan's China relationship point of view, this is actually a positive news. Economically, obviously it's bad, but I think this is one challenge. This challenge against Trump's tariff policy I think this actually provides a common ground between Japan, China, South Korea, and of course the EU. So this is a common challenge for all these countries where we can have some uniting ground. So in terms of, I think I'm actually jumping ahead to the next topic. From geopolitical point of view, this could actually help ease the tension in Asia.
We'll touch upon that interesting point. Before that, let's have Michael. Michael, please, explain to us, what are the possible effects on the U.S. consumers, on the U.S. business, as Mr. Okubo mentioned, in extreme sense, probably the U.S. is stopping importing stuff from other countries.
Well, yes, I think the effect to U.S. consumers will be quite heavy and quite in a bad way, right? U.S. inflation is at 3.2% in 2024. These tariffs could have a very noticeable impact on that. A 55% rate on $500 billion in Chinese goods, all the way from laptops to phones and electronics, might raise electronics prices by 10 to 15%, according to some analysts, right? In the auto sector, 25% tariffs on Canadian parts could add $1,000 per car. And the Mexican groceries, like things like avocados and tomatoes, might see a 20% increase. There are various estimates to show that the U.S. households could face an annual hit of a couple thousand U.S. dollars. 70% of the economy is in the U.S. is in consumption, so this will be hit very much hard, specifically electronics, auto, and food. In contrast, China redirects 70% of its exports away from the U.S. now, bolstering a $900 billion trade surplus, according to the World Bank. So it shows that basically this tariff war is something that the U.S. Will bear the most cost, whereas China will keep its flexibility in redirecting its trade flow to partners which are more cooperative.
What about the impact on the global supply chain or global trade?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question, right? China now is responsible for 31% of global trade. That's almost double, the United States. right? By some estimates say that industrial output by 2030 will be 50% of the world. So you can really not cut out the Chinese; it just gets redirected, right? These days, because of of these tariff policies, all of the manufacturing moved from China to places like Vietnam or Mexico. They had the big benefits, but at the same time, it's still just mostly Chinese supply chain parts with final assembly and that kind of thing, right? You have to ask yourself a question: if Vietnam can make a T-shirt at $2 cost, and there's now the 46% tariff, they were a little under $3, but the U.S. Baseline price in California is $10. It doesn't matter how big a tariff you put on it. You're not going to reshore that manufacturing to the U.S. So I think there's a little bit of some basic practicality that needs to be shown. China is just making too much of the goods. Even if it were diversified, China has the lowest cost basis. So if you want to be competitive, you need to use a Chinese supply chain. And so it's just trade as usual with extra steps and extra cost, unfortunately.
Well, Michael, of course, China has announced a 34% additional tariff on import the U.S. goods, on top of the existing rates. So that's pretty high, let's say. And also it announced the measures like, basically putting like 11 U.S. companies on this entity list, I guess, as related to their export of weapons to Taiwan. And then there's export control of rare earth minerals, 7 kinds of them. So that's the Chinese response, pretty solid. And of course, what's the potential, what's the outlook of this, the two countries in terms of trade? Are they somehow, obviously this is not the end of this trade war, if you can call it a trade war. Are they going to start a negotiation at a certain point, or how will they end?
Well, I think, China is being very reserved, right? I mean, there's a lot of larger escalation with different ways that China can escalate. You mentioned the rare earth metals, right? China controls 70% of the world's supply of these critical things. It's 40% of EV battery exports, right? So if China wanted to, it could just restrict these critical materials to the U.S. and U.S. manufacturing would grind to a halt. Right. China also can play with its currency. If you could devalue the Chinese currency, say like 5%, then Chinese exported goods have a competitive advantage. And there's so many things that China can do because it has such a dominant economy. And we mentioned before the sort of dual circulation strategy. Okay, the China could basically cut itself off from the rest of the world and rely on domestic consumption with zero trade and still be able to survive. So I think there's some systemic changes that need to happen, right? If basically what the U.S. is doing is causing a bifurcation in the world trade ecosystem, but China has spent $1.4 trillion on Belt and Road over the last decade. It has 140 countries on that, a quarter or so of a global population. It could redirect that trade from the U.S. to any of these other parts of the world in global south, and it looks like that's what will happen, right? Mm-hmm. And at some point, the U.S. will need to decide if they are done being isolationist, that these measures will surely backfire in a spectacular way. And if they want to be competitive and still a world-leading economy, then they need to connect to it.
Mm-hmm. And Professor Nalapat, if you take a look at the tariffs, on some of the Asian countries, basically a series of them. We mentioned 24% Japan, 26% Korea, 27% India, Indonesia 32%, and of course Cambodia 49%, Laos 48%, Vietnam 46%, Myanmar 45%, Sri Lanka 44%. For example, Myanmar, which is struggling to recover from this devastating earthquake, and now 44% tariffs on their export to the U.S. And Sri Lanka, which just secured I think is less than $3 billion US dollars from the IMF to bail out the economy. And then now there is 44% tariffs on them. And does that make sense?
Look, it depends on how you're looking at it. It depends on where you're looking. The elephant looks very different if you look at it from one direction or from the other or from the sides. So the reality is how you look at it. And quite frankly, so Trump is very, very conscious of public opinion. He does not want any shift in his approval ratings, and he's facing a very important set of elections in 2026, the US midterms. And if he does badly there, his party does badly there, well, long before it does so, where you will have all these surveys in place, and the people in the party will then counsel him, and they will ensure that many of these steps do not get activated. So I'm in no panic about this entire situation. There is a short-term negative reaction, but I'm in no panic about it because Trump is a person who essentially keeps changing his policies depending on what he believes the situation is likely to be. And he's got some fixations, like tariff, for example, but even those policies, once he finds, supposing he finds a risk that those policies are going to create problems for the Republican majority in the House and Senate, a majority on which it depends to carry out his agenda, and those majorities vanish, well, he can't carry out the agenda for the next 2 years of his term. So he knows that. And therefore, I'm not quite worried. I think that there will be adjustments made. And yes, I agree, some of these steps, for example, we're talking about allied countries. Well, the reality is you can't do without the US, and the US can't do without its security partners, whether it's the EU, whether it's Japan, whether it's South Korea, whether it's India, and none of these countries can do without the US. So ultimately, I think security is going to be one of the issues, apart from public opinion, that drives the internal debate on how many of this should be continued, how many should be discontinued, and how they should be altered.
Well, Mr. Okubo, earlier you mentioned about the long-term consequence, long-term impact on, for example, other economies, EU, Japan, China. Not long ago, financial officials from Japan, China, South Korea, they met each other, talked about, closer cooperation in terms of economy, in terms of trade, investment. So are you seeing, you mentioned about Trump's tariff might provide rooms, for these countries to further cooperate with each other. And if you go beyond that, RCEP, for example, these are 3 countries, plus 10 ASEAN countries, Australia, New Zealand. So we are going to see probably closer trade and investment relationship among these countries?
Yes, indeed. I think that's exactly the point. I think while U.S. want to isolate itself, well, let them do it. But then somebody need to carry on this global regime of free trade. And that's where EU, China, Japan, South Korea, well, the rest of the world, except the U.S., comes in. So like you mentioned, there are many multilateral trade regime we have created in the past. RCEP is one, TPP-CP is one, and obviously WTO was one, although it stopped functioning. So while U.S. Has gone mad, just let them stay, keep the madman away, and let the sane people, let the sane policymaker in China, EU, Japan, just continue on to make sure that the free trade regime in the world is kept until U.S. basically changed its president.
Well, Adam, that's a good point. We are seeing the Chinese side and the European Union, they are talking about as early as possible to start a negotiation on the tariffs on the EVs, Chinese EVs. You do see this kind of moves. Basically, they say, okay, let's fix our problem. Obviously, the signal is very clear. That is, let's cooperate better, probably, while facing the tariffs from Washington. So, and also another point is like, I think there's a responsibility, some people to say, for the EU, for China, Japan, etc., on their shoulders, to continue with this multilateral trade, and safeguard those rules. WTO rules. If there's dispute, we can solve this problem by following specific rules. What's your opinion on that?
Like I said earlier, the European Commissioner Šefčovič was in town just last week meeting with his counterpart from the Ministry of Commerce, Wang Wentao, and they signed a new agreement on food and beverage. They looked at customs issues. They did talk about the e-vehicle issues as well. So yeah, like the previous commentator said, we have to work together. If we can't work with the U.S. right now, we should try and solve the issues that we have together at a bilateral or a regional level as well. I was actually just on a call with my counterpart at the European Chamber in Australia, talking to him, asking him how Australia was affected by this. And he said their immediate reaction was to follow up with the EU to try and sign the trade agreement that they've been trying to sign for a long time together. So I know the EU, in its response to these and other issues in the past, has been, if we can't work together, then we'll find other people to work with. And I think the EU has actually demonstrated that quite strongly by having a number of free trade agreements that have been signed in the region with South Korea, with New Zealand, with Vietnam. And again, EU and China have also been talking about a potential agreement as well, as we know from the past. And perhaps that's something that might come about as well. But going back to, I just want to comment on something earlier on the supply chain effect that you asked about. I have to say, though, many of our members here in China, they are affected by this. Approximately half of our members are affected by by U.S.-China relations, and the supply chain relationship is extremely important. And the trend we've seen in the last few years has been one of siloing, where we've got more and more onshoring coming into China so that they can safeguard the market they have in China, and in areas where they're worried about being hit by partners, being on whatever entity lists or what have you, for businesses outside of China, they've been moving outside as a result. So the world is reacting. Businesses are reacting to what's happening, and this sudden change, I don't think anybody could have foreseen as it being as heavy as it is. But I think it's only going to drive companies to be even more conservative in their decision making, trying to wait out this period of, well, I'd call it predictable uncertainty with Trump's policies.
It's causing a lose-lose situation, kind of. Mr. Okubo, a hard question probably. Like, can the rest of the world live without the U.S.?
Yes. Right after World War II, U.S. economy was half the world. So unless you have a good access to the market, I think it was difficult for the global economy to function. But now that U.S. is still large, but it's one of the large companies. EU is just as big as U.S. China in the near future is going to be just as big as U.S. So the world can live without U.S. It's better we live with U.S., but U.S. I think we have to figure out the way that until U.S. changes its mind and become normal again, we have to find a way to help each other and share our economy together and try to live with this crazy policies in U.S.
Well, on that note, we are coming to the end for today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.